The Second World War was easily the most devastating war in history. Some official records put the total number of dead close to 60 million, though the real toll may be far higher. Not everyone died in combat either. More than 45 million of them were civilians, as everyday folk around the world bore the brunt of a war that would come to be known for the exceptional scale and degree of its brutality. Number 10. Chichima Incident. Instances of cannibalism showed up throughout the war, especially on the Eastern Front, where the fighting took a particularly grisly form. Most of them were driven by necessity, like during the siege of Leningrad, where thousands of people took to consuming human flesh due to starvation and extreme cold. In some rare, horrifying cases, however, cannibalism was also practiced just for the sport of it. One particularly infamous case was the Chichima Incident, where 8 American airmen were captured, tortured, murdered with bamboo sticks. 4 of the men were then eaten by Japanese officers. According to their testimonies during post-war trials, the meat was cooked with soy sauce and vegetables. One officer even believed that it's good for the stomach. In one fascinating twist, there was actually a 9th airman who managed to avoid capture, a 20-year-old pilot named George H.W. Bush. According to later records and witness testimonies, this wasn't an isolated incident. The Chichima Incident was only one of the many cases of cannibalism perpetrated by Imperial Japanese forces across the Pacific Theater, often against POWs and occupied civilian populations. Number 9. Gardleague Massacre. While Nazi atrocities continued throughout the war, some of the worst massacres took place during its final phases. As the Red Army and Western Allied troops pressed into Germany, large-scale efforts were undertaken to hide any evidence of the crimes, either by killing the thousands of prisoners still living in concentration camps or by forcing them on long death marches to camps close to Berlin. Gardleague was one such camp some 90 miles west of Berlin, where over 4,000 prisoners had arrived from different parts of Germany. On April the 13th, 1945, more than 1,000 of them were taken to a barn, barricaded inside, and set on fire with gasoline and flamethrowers. Almost all of the victims, a majority of them Poles, were burned alive or shot to death, save for 6 survivors rescued by advancing Allied forces barely 2 days after the massacre. Number 8. Kaunas pogroms. The anti-Jewish pogroms in Kaunas, Lithuania began almost as soon as Germany crossed into the USSR on the 22nd of June 1941, beginning a horrifying chapter of the Holocaust that's now largely forgotten. Unlike the industrialized, almost indifferent methods used in German extermination camps, the violence in Lithuania and southern eastern territories was much more personal, often meted out in the form of beatings with blunt weapons and violent public executions. The most infamous incident was the Lashkar's Garage Massacre, beginning on the 27th of June, where around 60 Jewish men were beaten to death with metal crowbars by local Lithuanian nationalists. According to an eyewitness report by a German photographer, the main perpetrator was a man nicknamed Death Dealer, as the crowd, made of German soldiers and local Lithuanians, cheered and clapped throughout the whole thing. Number 7. Bengal famine. The Bengal famine of 1943 was one of the biggest catastrophes of the war, killing more than 3 million people in the Indian state due to widespread starvation and disease. Many factors contributed to it, especially the wartime events in 1942. As the British strongholds of Singapore and Myanmar fell into Japanese hands, food exports from them came to a halt, combined with crop infections and natural disasters, which reduced the overall yield. Some later studies, however, suggest that it wasn't a lack of supplies that caused the famine, as the 1943 yield had still been enough to feed the local population of Bengal. Food supplies were rather actively moved out of the province to support the war in the Middle East, or hoarded in special wartime stores, creating shortages and inflation for the local population. Fearing a Japanese invasion, the provincial government confiscated huge quantities of rice and thousands of fishing boats across Bengal, crippling the food transport system in the region. Number 6. 1941 Odessa Massacre. The Ukrainian city of Odessa was occupied by Nazi-backed Romanian forces on October the 16th, 1941, after more than 2 months of fierce fighting against Soviet forces. On October the 22nd, one of the occupied buildings blew up due to a remotely controlled mine, possibly planted by Red Army soldiers before the occupation. The blast killed 67 people, including the Romanian military commandant and a number of Romanian and German officers. In retaliation, Roman soldiers and SS Death Squad members, allied with local ethnic German groups, went on a rampage against the local Jewish population, beginning a dark chapter of the Holocaust that's now hardly talked about. More than 30,000 Jewish citizens of Odessa were rounded up in barracks, jails, and makeshift camps and murdered, on the 22nd and 23rd of October. Many of them were locked in warehouses and burned alive. According to witness accounts, the smell of burned bodies stayed in the air for days. The 1941 massacre of Odessa was only one of the many crimes committed by Romanian forces on the Eastern Front. Close to 410,000 people were killed in Odessa and the surrounding Transnistria region throughout the war, often by forced starvation, exhaustion, and extreme cold. Number 5. Warsaw. The Warsaw Uprising began on August 1, 1944, when members of the Polish Resistance Home Army mounted a coordinated offensive against the occupying Axis forces across Warsaw. In response, Hitler issued the Order for Warsaw on the same day, directing his forces in Poland to completely destroy the city and exterminate its population. What followed was utter and complete destruction of one of the most thriving cities in Europe before the war, as every single building in the city was systematically razed to the ground by Nazi squads. Despite some successes in the beginning, the uprising was eventually crushed. Many Warsaw residents were burned alive in the ensuing massacres, and many others were lined up and shot. The violence took a particularly ugly form in the district of Ochota, where the collaborationalist Russian National Liberation Army, or Rona, made up of captured Russian soldiers and ex-prisoners, systematically killed anyone they could find. Many women were raped and then burned alive in public as the violence claimed the lives of at least 10,000 people. Number 4. Siege of Leningrad. When German and Finnish forces laid siege to the Russian city of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, on September the 8th, 1941, they expected little resistance. It was still the beginning phase of the Axis advance into the Russian heartland, as Red Army forces were retreating with heavy losses across the entire front. A quick takeover of the city, then one of the jewels of the Bolshevik Empire, would do well to enhance troop morale, as well as to provide a strategic point from which to launch further attacks. Little did they know, though, that it would turn out to be the most grueling and drawn-out battle that they'd ever fight. It was the longest, and perhaps the most destructive blockade of a civilian population in history, lasting for a total of 872 days. The city was continuously bombarded by German artillery and Luftwaffe bombing runs, often using incendiary ammunition that set parts of the city ablaze. As the biting winter of 1941 to 1942 set in, starvation had turned into an epidemic, as the city lost more than 100,000 people per month due to a severe shortage of food supplies. More than 2,000 people were booked for cannibalism by the local police, though the actual number was likely far higher. Leningrad was finally liberated by the Red Army on the 27th of January 1944. By the time the war was over, the city's population was reduced from 2.5 million to 800,000. Making it one of the deadliest sieges in history. Number 3. The fall of Singapore. The British stronghold of Singapore fell into Japanese hands on February 15, 1942, which remains the largest surrender of British forces in history. For the next 2 weeks or so, Imperial Japanese forces went on a systematic campaign to eradicate the city's Chinese population and other people deemed undesirable to the Japanese war effort. Anywhere between 5,000 to 50,000 people were massacred during the purge, now remembered as Sukching, translated to purge through cleansing, among the Chinese community in Singapore. The anti-Chinese attitudes among Japanese soldiers were fueled by the grueling front in China, as around 10 to 20% of the local Chinese population was killed by machine guns, beheading, bayonets, bombings, and other violent methods during the massacre. Number 2. Firebombing of Hamburg. On July the 24th, 1943, at around 1 a.m., British and American bombers began a terrifying bombing run against the second largest German city at the time, Hamburg. Armed with high explosives and a slew of newly perfected incendiary bombs, the operation, codenamed Operation Gomorrah, marked a horrifying turning point in the war. It was the first of many Allied operations directed at civilian centers and other non-military targets in Germany and Japan, a strategy that would be later repeated on a larger scale in Dresden, Tokyo, and ultimately Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The raids went on for more than a week, subjecting the residents of Hamburg to a kind of horror that no one had ever experienced until that time. The worst of it came on July the 27th, when the bombs created a massive firestorm that burned thousands of people alive in a matter of hours. Street temperatures were as high as 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind speeds of over 170 miles per hour, setting fire to around 16,000 buildings that were home to more than 450,000 people. The British pilots flying above even reported turbulence and a strong stench of burning flesh due to the storm. At least 37,000 people were killed by the time it was over, as over 9,000 tons of bombs were dropped on Hamburg in a matter of a few days. Number 1. Actian T4. The German government passed the law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring in 1933, making sterilization mandatory for anyone with diseases considered genetic at the time. Between 1933 and 1939, more than 360,000 people with conditions like schizophrenia, epilepsy, and even alcoholism were sterilized in camps converted from prisons, hospitals, schools, and other public buildings across Germany. It was only the beginning of a long and horrifying process to remove what the Nazis considered undesirable afflictions mutations in the German gene pool. This ultimately resulted in the T4 program. Implemented immediately after the onset of war in 1939, it was a mass euthanasia program carried out at 6 facilities in Germany and Austria, using techniques that would later be replicated on a much larger scale during the Holocaust. At first, T4 only included infants and toddlers, though it was expanded to adults with disabilities and mental illnesses soon after. While the program was officially discontinued in 1941, killings continued throughout the war years, claiming the lives of close to 250,000 people by the end of it.